Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin. I am joined by my love, my darling, Matthew. Hi, Matt.
Hey, everybody. Hi.
Before I get into our story for today, just the usual reminders to rate, like, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get the podcast, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcast, is it Overcast? Right. So
Overcast is a client.
Okay. For a second, I didn't know if I had the right name, but wherever you get your podcasts. And we also have a Patreon. All that's always in the description. There'll be a link below. Today, we're going way back. We're going to a part of history that we have not covered yet, the Anglo-Saxon period. Matt, I don't know how familiar you are with this time in history. I'm going to say not much.
Pretty much in the dark. So
All right.
You're going to have to guide me through the fog here.
You know I will. You know I'll give you and the listeners all the details. Probably too much details. I'd rather give you too much than too little. We are talking about Harold Godwinson or Harold Godwin. Just a note on naming conventions too. I'm using Godwin as Harold's last name. At this point in time, people don't have what we think of as last names. You usually see him referred to as Harold Godwin's son because he's literally Godwin's son. It's that Scandinavian naming convention. Makes it easy. I'll try not to go back and forth between the names so it's not confusing, but no promises. Just a note on the name before we do get started. If you're like Matt, you might hear Harold Godwinson and say, who is that? But even if you might not recognize the name by itself, if you know the Norman Conquest or William the Conqueror, you will know Harold. He was the king that William defeated and killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But Harold's far from just the unlucky guy shown with an arrow through his eye on the Bayeux Tapestry. To some, he stands as the last true Anglo-Saxon king, the final bastion, the final defender of England before the brutality of the conquest and the conqueror. To others, he's remembered as an oath breaker, every bit as ambitious and rapacious as his powerful father before him. And now, with Harold back in the spotlight, thanks to King and Conqueror airing in the UK and soon to be airing here in the US, it feels like the right moment to ask who was the real Harold Godwinson. Hopefully we can get as close to that as possible today. This will be a two-parter. Today we're going to cover a lot of Harold's background, namely the story of his father, which I think really you do need to know in order to fully understand the picture of what comes after. So it's going to be Harold's father's story for a lot of this piece, but Harold will come in later. For my research, I read The House of Godwin, The Rise and Fall of an Anglo-Saxon Dynasty. Very good. Recommend. 2 thumbs up. Let's get right in. So as I said, we need to rewind a generation to get ourselves acquainted with both Harold's family and the sticky situation in England, as it will become very important to the story. A lot of these people that we will talk about now, them and their histories will come back and bear fruit later. I love storytelling, but I promise that this one has a purpose. In order to understand Harold's story, we need to understand the England and the family into which he was born. Context is always important, but especially here. Plus, it's good to have another nobleman to compare Harold's actions to. So we're going to use his father here. And then we can chart how Harold is both alike and unlike his dad. When Godwin, Harold's dad, was born around the year 1000 or so, it was a bad time to live in England, to say the least. If you were near any waterway or on the coast, it was hell. I bet you can guess why. You might have already seen the script, but I'm going to wager that you can guess.
This I know. I'm not completely in the dark. England at the time has visitors.
Got a problem.
There are angry tourists trawling the coasts, and they're anxious to get inside those monasteries and haul off the occasional chalice or valuable artifact from medieval England. It's Vikings.
It is. It's Vikings. These Vikings, they raided, they plundered, they were bought off by the kings at some point. Rather than fighting a battle and lose and having to buy them off. The kings were just like, here, we'll give you money up front. But that also didn't work. That only worked for about 5 whole minutes before the Vikings came back for more. And paying them off just advertised also how wealthy England actually was. So to borrow that iconic Mad Men moment, not great, Bob. England had been a patchwork of kingdoms like Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex before this. I'm sure you guys might have heard of those different kingdoms, but the Wessex dynasty had come out on top, in large part thanks to a name you definitely heard before, Alfred the Great. Under him, England was mostly unified for the first time. The trouble was Alfred's descendants were having a much harder time holding it all together as wave after wave after wave of Viking raids kept literally crashing onto England's shores. Ethelred the Unready was perhaps the most, well, we're just going to have to say it, unready of those Anglo-Saxon kings who came after Alfred the Great. Unready is an awful nickname to be given, although this is where I'm meant to inform you that in the original language, it's less that he's unready for the Vikings and more that he had bad counsel. It was not a nickname that he had at the time, but the fact that Ethelred did so poorly against the Vikings immortalized his name forevermore. So when people talk about the Vikings, they talk about Ethelred the Unready. At this time that Godwin, Harold's dad, was a teenager, Ethelred the Unready's reign was already coming apart at the seams. He was giving the Vikings tons of money to prevent battle. However, as we already said, this did not stop the Vikings from continuing to return year after year. The country's treasury had been drained and its people demoralized and angry. Their king was not protecting them. What's the point of having a king if he can't protect you? So this was the perfect time for the King of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, to swoop in and decide to take the throne himself, which he did in 1013. Side note, Forkbeard, also a great nickname. Ethelred and the royal family, they fled to Normandy. They chose Normandy as his second wife. Emma of Normandy was from there. One of Ethelred's sons with Emma, Edward, you should keep in the back of your mind. He will later be known by his epitaph, the Confessor. This is Edward the Confessor. Edward, for context, was born only a few years after Godwin, so they're contemporaries. They're about the same age. Ethelred had his one piece of good luck when Sweyn Forkbeard died within the next year, allowing Ethelred to be invited back to be king, so long as he promised to be better this time around. So it's just like that bad boyfriend or girlfriend. Ethelred promised this time it would be different. He would be different.
And to whom would he have made the promise? The nobles? The leading families?
Yeah, so this is where I think it's the Witan is the royal council in Anglo-Saxon England. When Sweyn Forkbeard dies, he does have a son who we will talk about in a minute. But the Witan, the council, they're like, okay, Ethelred, we'll give you another shot as long as you don't act like you were acting before. And he says, perfect, I will do that. But we all know how that story usually goes when people make promises like that. And again, we have Sweyn Forkbeard, the Dane, the Viking. He had a son, Canute, who was ready to invade England and take it as his own kingdom. He thought he should be the one to rule England, not Ethelred. And this is where Ethelred did the most strategic thing he ever did and died on cue.
Clever.
The best thing he ever did. And with that, Canute the Dane, Sweyn Forkbeard's son, became King of England. To legitimize his rule even more, he married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy. Emma and Canute seemed to get on a lot better than Emma did with her previous husband. So when Emma would later commission a history, she left her first husband, Ethelred, out entirely. So you would never know in that history that she was married to him. Rough for Ethelred.
Down the memory hole centuries before Orwell. Well done.
Ethelred's taken losses left and right, all over the place. Emma also seems to have kind of abandoned her sons with Ethelred, Edward and Alfred, who remained in Normandy. They would stay in exile for decades as their mother had children with King Canute. So we've got a lot of awkward family dynamics, to say the least, in England with this new royal family. And we haven't even mentioned that Canute also had another wife. He has a hand-fasted wife, You're probably asking how in the heck Canute's allowed to have two wives. If you are wondering if there is some top secret loophole in the church that allows you to have two wives that you never heard of, unfortunately, there is not. Matt, I don't know if you want to mention how the church viewed marriage at this point, because marriage isn't quite marriage that we think of it at this point in time.
How far back do we want to go on this question?
We don't have to go that far. Again, if Canute can have two wives, I think people are going to be asking, why is that? If you're a New Girl fan, I'm just thinking of the New Girl scene where Nick tells Schmidt, you think you can have a bunch of wives, you get one wife? You get one wife? Well, technically, that isn't true at this point in time. And spoiler, Harold will also have two wives. So it's an important question to clear up at this moment.
Ethelred has sequential monogamous partners, but you're asking about Canute having like a concubinal.
Yeah, you will see with Harold, his first wife, sometimes called the concubine or hand-fasted wife.
My understanding of this, which is, and the Venn diagram here is barely overlapping with what I have some knowledge of, because I do teach comparative religion, and a lot of my coursework was in political science. So during this period, there's no parliament, as you pointed out, and power in England is dictated by moots and shreves. So it's just, you have to understand the whole period is, but from our perspective, it looks very fragmented. There's not a lot of like holistic nationalistic control.
The Wessex dynasty has really only been in control for not that long, and that's loosely, and that's mainly the South. The North kind of does what it wants for a very long time after that.
Yeah. One way to think of it would be that the one institution that's providing some degree of harmony and interconnectedness between the different corners of Europe is the Catholic Church. But this is also a period where what the church would classify as pagan belief is still pretty vibrant, still has a lot of traction.
Canute himself was born pagan, and then after he converted to Christianity, he has to really make a show of it, including going to visit the Pope in Rome.
Right. So we've reached a stage where you have to do that to maintain political legitimacy. And that's kind of the key word. The church does not recognize both marriages as the same.
The one in the church is superior. That's why Em would have the upper hand.
Emma's union with him is the sacramental one that's recognized, but the so-called hand-fasted relationship is tolerated because they know that it's politically necessary for his standing within the Norse community.
Although it will cause issues later on.
It's going to create problems with, my vague memory is that it creates succession problems.
As always,
later.
if you have multiple, the problem Henry VIII would have loved to have, where if you've got a lot of sons by different wives, were before primogeniture really exists, which is where the firstborn son.
Oh, the oldest son gets everything, right?
This is kind of who's ever the strongest gets the kingship, gets the power at this point in time.
And it's important to understand, too, that, the marriages across dynastic lines are mechanisms to keep the peace. And there's a whole theory of medieval history which argues that that's one of the church's primary functions, is that a marriage is not legitimate unless it's sanctioned by the church. So when they annul one marriage and embrace another or fail to, it's their mechanism for trying to not just consolidate their own power, because to the extent that people feel they have that power, it gives them enormous influence. In a universe where they don't necessarily have some of the traditional tools of power, like, eventually the Pope will have his own army.
Yep.
Eventually the Pope will have, but not at this stage. But then it's also supposed to be like in a post-imperial, post-Roman political landscape, what the church is supposed to be doing with these marriages that it encourages and these parallel relationships that it tolerates is it's trying to keep the peace. It's trying to maintain as much harmony as it can. There's even a theory that when the Crusades come along later, that maybe subconsciously church leadership sees that as a wonderful way to get European lords to stop butchering one another. and to rally behind the banners of Christendom and, go butcher someone else. So
Fair point. I see where they're going there, even if I don't like the outcome. But the point is, Canute's got 2 wives. He's got Emma. Emma's the previous King Ethelred's widow, so he's marrying her to solidify his claim on the English throne. These, we're talking about these multiple families, and Emma, obviously, having her sons, Alfred and Edward in Normandy. These fissions in the family, they're going to have lasting impacts, not only for the royal family, but Godwin and his clan. It is under this new Anglo-Danish ruler, Canute, that Godwin, who's Harold's dad, really begins his rise to prominence. Godwin was what you'd call a new man. He's elevated by King Canute, who, like any usurper at any point in history, needed a loyal circle of men who owed everything to him. Godwin would be perfect for that role. He didn't come from a glittering old lineage. He's not a peasant, but he's lower stock than, obviously, the kings of Wessex. He must have shown some kind of shrewd political instincts, and that's exactly what Canute needed as he set about ruling a country that was not his own. He's from Denmark. He's still getting used to what England is. By steering carefully through the chaos of Ethelred's fall and Canute's takeover, Godwin laid the groundwork for the Godwin's family eventual dominance. In order to cement the relationship between Godwin and King Canute, Godwin was married into Canute's family. He married Geitha, who was Canute's sister-in-law. There's this open question about whether he was married into Canute's wider family because of his prominence, or did he become prominent after he married Geitha? I don't think it really matters for our purposes, but it was most likely the first option. He starts to become prominent in the court, and then he's given Canute's sister-in-law as a wife. Around this time, you just see Godwin's name appearing everywhere on the charter witness list. That's usually what people go to at this time in Anglo-Saxon England to see who holds power, who's around the king. The higher your name is on a charter list, that means the closer to the king you stood. So if your name's coming right after the king, you're doing good. And Godwin wasn't just climbing the list, he was becoming the dominant magnate in England. Godwin's loyalty to Canute paid off. By 1020. He was the Earl of Wessex and controlled a huge amount of land and wealth. Godwin also fathered a small army of children with Geitha, including the topic of our conversation today, Harold. But Harold wasn't the oldest. That was Sweyn, named after Canute's dad, Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn, though, quickly proved himself too much of a hot mess, derogatory, to be prime heir material. It was the second son, Harold, born in 1022, who ended up far more in his father's mold. This is where we'll also pause on the name for a second. Harold isn't an English name. It sounds very English to us, but at this time, it's not an Anglo-Saxon name. It's Scandinavian. It's Danish. So with his Danish wife, Godwin wasn't unusual in wanting to cozy up to the Danish English king, being Danish, or at least pretending to be. It's all the rage. It's trendy for the native Anglo-Saxons. This is where I do want to point out that we tend to fixate on the Norman influence that took over England later. Sorry, Harold. But there's far less attention on the Anglo-Danish, Scandinavian hybrid society that came before it, came first. It makes sense, though. You think about the water surrounding England made travel to Denmark and Sweden and Norway easier than getting on your horse and heading to, say, Scotland. And then you have the Vikings coming in, a lot of them staying as settlers, and now you have an actual Danish king as King of England. There was no reason to think, too, that the Danish dynasty was not there to stay. So everybody's going to be sucking up to Canute and the Danes. In talking about this all, I want you to think of our young Harold. He's coming of age in an England that's rocked by dynastic uncertainty, invasion, and his family riding the tides of fate and favor into power, at least for now. More turmoil still lay ahead before Harold would come of age. And he and his siblings weren't just heirs to Godwin's lands. these children would become essential pieces of Godwin's political dynasty that would soon rival even the royal family. Speaking of the children of Godwin and Geetha, there are at least 2 others I want to mention besides Harold. There are a lot of them, but these 2 we do need to mention because they're going to come into the story. First, we have Edith, who was about 3 years younger than Harold, so remember that name.
Putting her on my scorecard.
I do want to apologize because she's going to be far from the last Edith. Like every woman is named Catherine in Tudor England. It seems like every woman in this period's an Edith, so I'm sorry. There's going to be a lot of Ediths. The other child we should note is Tostig, who's the younger brother of Harold by about 4 years. So both Edith and Tostig, sometimes known as Tosti, would play important roles in the years to come. In terms of the sibling dynamics, the sibling relationships, we don't know a ton, though Edith would later give us some detail into their lives and personality. So thanks, girl. We so appreciate someone thinking of future history podcasters. She commissions a chronicle that gives us a lot of this detail, including stuff about their personalities, which you don't really normally get at this point in time. I mean, think of how many of the ancient Rome and some of those other ones where you're just dying for more details. Edith was like, I get you. You're going to want more details. And she delivers. Edith and Tostig would end up closer than Edith and Harold in adulthood, and that bond may have started early. I'll talk more about the contrast between the brothers once they're grown. But even as kids, you do see this hint of a rivalry between Harold and Tostig. You get a story from one of the histories that describes an incident when the 2 were just boys. They were playing some game in front of their father. Quote, so hotly do they play that both are made very angry, end quote. And in classic older brother fashion, Harold smacked Tostig. Quote, he gave such a blow that it strikes him, Tostig, down there and quite stuns him. We do get that detail from a childhood story.
Medieval concussion protocol, it sounds like.
Yeah, poor Tostig. We don't get a lot of stories, again, like this about figures who lived as long.
I wonder why.
But it's fascinating because even if it's ordinary, 2 brothers going at it, getting competitive during a game, it's not exactly a unique story.
That's true.
It's still nice to get these little anecdotes. Unfortunately, they don't indicate whether or not Harold put Tostig in the dryer.
Oh, yes, that's a story from well, that was an important game that we played in the 1970s.
Yeah, what was it called?
The space program. My older brother felt that it would be cool if I experienced what it was like to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere in a Gemini capsule. I was put into the dryer, and we turned the dryer on. I survived. It's fine. And I got to experience, the excitement of reentry.
I have a feeling Harold might have done the same to Tostig. Unfortunately, lived in a time before dryers. Sad situation.
Or space programs.
Yeah. They could only dream.
I would not want to see medieval England's space program. It's a lot of wood.
I don't know. The Vikings, I feel like they could have pulled it off.
Yeah, if anyone could do it, it's probably them. But they would find the moon lacking in monasteries to raid.
What's even the point if you can't grab a chalice? I mean, we're there for the gold, man.
I know.
There is, though, a reason that we get these anecdotes about Harold and Tostig. The chroniclers who gave us these stories, they knew what was to come. The Godwin siblings, like the Roys from the show Succession, would learn in time that power has a way of corroding all bonds, even those between brothers and sisters. We don't get much detail about Harold's childhood, unsurprisingly, besides that little story about brotherly love, yet we can see the world around him change. With his father so involved in court politics, Harold must have been at least somewhat aware of what was going on, especially as he grew into his teenage years. In 1035, King Canute died young, only in his 40s, leaving the succession once again up in the air. Canute had those 2 wives, which we already talked about. We've got Emma of Normandy, who we already mentioned was the previous king's wife, and he also had been handfasted to another English woman, Elfgafu of Northampton.
Oh, my.
I know.
Say that again?
Elfgafu. I deserve gold stars for pronouncing these Anglo-Saxon names. So many extra A's, so many vowels. So nobody come for me if I'm slightly mispronouncing them. I am doing my best. So you're going to have two lines vying for the English throne, leaving people like Godwin to figure out who to ally themselves with. We don't have time to dwell on all the details of each of the kings because there are some of quick succession. As again, this is a story about Harold, not Godwin, although Godwin does loom large in this episode. There are a few spots that I want to stop along just to give context for later. When Canute died, it launched a succession crisis between his sons by his two marriages. Folks, this is why you don't have two wives. You had Harold Harefoot by his wife Elfgafu of Northampton, and then Harthacnut by Emma of Normandy. Harthacnut was in Denmark at the time of his father's death and delayed coming over to England, which left his half-brother Harold Harefoot open to take the English throne, which he did. Godwin backed Harthacnut, but was able to bide his time under the new regime of Harold Harefoot. There's an episode that I do want to mention, as it will come up later. Emma of Normandy, unhappy with her stepson as king. Apparently Emma and Elfgafu did not like each other, so having Elfgafu's son on the throne, not great for Emma. She wrote to her sons in exile, Edward and Alfred, to come and claim their birthright. Later, she'd claim it was a forgery with her name on it. You'll see why. Both sons left for England in 1036 to stake their claim. Godwin received Alfred when he got to England. Godwin had always been Team Emma, Alfred's mom, Emma of Normandy, so Alfred likely thought he would be a safe person to go to once he landed. To him, this is an ally. The book, too, says he likely thought Godwin was still acting in the interests of Emma and her sons. Alfred does appear to have gone to Godwin on his own free will. He wasn't trapped or anything. This would be a mistake. Whatever Godwin was, he was a survivor, and the man who had given Godwin his power had been King Canute, Harold Harefoot's father. Godwin, it appears, had switched sides from Emma to Harold Harefoot's camp. What we know is that Godwin handed over the young prince, Alfred, to Harold Harefoot's men. He betrayed Alfred, Emma, and by extension, the old Anglo-Saxon Wessex line of kings. Again, this should not have been too surprising for a man who had done everything to be as Danish as possible. If he had to decide between the old line of Wessex kings and the Danish kings, he was going to go with the Danes. Godwin was accused of betraying him, handing him over to Harold Harefoot's men, who blinded Alfred so brutally that he died of his wounds. If you're wondering about the blinding, that is something they would do back then. If you had a claim to a throne, to some sort of powerful position, in order to take you out of that consideration, they would blind you because it's might over right. Bloodline is important, but being able to lead somebody into battle at this time, very important to be a king. So if you blind somebody, then they're not going to be able to do that. In this case, though, Alfred did die after the blinding. As you can imagine, the question of Godwin being involved in the death of Alfred, this is going to come back to haunt him, especially once the other son, Alfred's brother, Edward, finally became king. It would set the scene, perhaps, for some simmering resentments between Edward, Godwin, and later, Godwin's family. Harold Harefoot would not last long, though. He died in 1040, still only in his mid-20s. That left the path for Canute's other son, by Emma of Normandy, to come over, Harthacnut. Finally, Harthacnut decided to get off his butt and go to England and claim his throne, which he did. In 1040, so now you have Emma's son with Canute on the throne, and this new king invited his half-brother Edward to court, and then Harthacnut promptly died soon after. Got a lot of kings just dropping like flies at this point.
Is that another strategic death?
There's always questions between these.
Oh, foul play?
Possibly. We don't really know. He was still in his 20s. Same with Harold Harefoot, Canute's other son. They all die young. And then Canute, like I mentioned, only died in his 40s. So there's a chance maybe there was some sort of genetic thing there. But also there were a lot of people around them that might have wanted them gone. So we don't have great evidence of it being foul play, but I also wouldn't be shocked if it was. Harthacnut. He didn't have any kids. He invited Edward back to court, and once he dies, that ends the Danish line of kings of England. And you've got a princeling and etheling there at court, so this makes the succession really easy. And FYI, because it will come up later, an etheling is their word for prince. We will have somebody else who has the name the Etheling later on, so that's just a note. You've got Edward there, perfect. He's there, he's ready to take over. Now we've got solidly the old Wessex line of kings back. And you've got Godwin there along for the ride. And this is, if you're trying to figure out, do I know Edward? This is the man we know as Edward the Confessor. Edward, he's already pretty old at this point. He's nearing 40. And he had spent the last 20 years of his life in Normandy, not in England. He's Norman, at least culturally Norman. He hasn't really spent any time, probably doesn't even remember England from when he was younger. It's really here, under Edward the Confessor's reign, that Godwin and increasingly his family, including our man Harold, would find themselves even closer to power than they had in the past. But of course, the higher you rise, the further the fall. Godwin, Harold, now in his early 20s, and the rest of the Godwin clan would have been there in Winchester on January 23rd, 1045, to see one of their own marrying the new king. So Edith, Harold's younger sister, was Edward the Confessor's bride. Edith, she's around 20 years old. Edward's, like I said, about twice that. So got a big age disparity here. With a king and a crown, a Godwin was now queen. So we've got a Godwin on the throne, not as king, but as queen. Edith marrying the king can be called nothing less than a coup for Godwin and his family. Godwin had stood next to a king for years, being one of the first to sign those charters, but with his daughter installed as queen, the next line of kings would be directly related to Godwin. He might not be royalty himself, but any heir from Edith and Edward would be his blood. This boded well for Harold and the rest of the siblings. Not only would they get that favor from their new brother-in-law, if Edward died before any potential children came of age, you would only assume it would be Godwin or one of his sons that would hold the real power. I should say that we shouldn't just assume that this marriage only benefited Godwin. Harold and the rest of the family, for the moment, as I said, Edward as king needed and perhaps wanted them close because he had been away from England for most of his life. He needed homegrown allies, and there weren't any there that were as powerful as Godwin. If he needs to align himself with a family in England to give him a power base, the Godwins are the ones to do it. Those are the ones he wants to marry into. Whether Edward still blamed Godwin for what happened to his brother Alfred, we can't know. We don't know. And it's after Edith and Edward's wedding that Harold really began to step into his own. We finally get these glimpses of Harold from the wedding of his sister to Edward onwards. He's in his early 20s, but he's coming of age. Godwin had long been at the center of politics, but now as his children came of age, the whole family moved into position. Anywhere you turn, there's a Godwin, and that's exactly how they wanted it to be. I don't know if you're familiar with the War of the Roses. There's Elizabeth Woodville's family, the Woodvilles, who dominated court. So this is something kind of similar where they're all there. There's a bunch of them, and they're all involved. They all get high places in government. It's only weeks after Edith married Edward the Confessor that Harold received the earldom of East Anglia. Coming an earl, not bad for a 22-year-old. Can you imagine? Well, I was going to say that, but Nepo babies have always been a thing. It shouldn't be too surprising. But for a 22-year-old, not bad. There's no dukes or anything in England at this time. Being an earl is the top level. Unless you're king, nobody really above you. And now he'd have his own lands, his own money. He could start to come into his own and out of his powerful father's long shadow. Godwin would still be the undisputed head of the family, yet in his own lands, Harold could now start to exert his power. This is his apprenticeship in a way, learning how to be an earl, watching, taking lessons from his father. And again, I know that we're talking a lot about Godwin, the father. However, he dominated the family as he dominated the court. It would not really be until he was gone that Harold would truly step into the spotlight. We think around this time when he became an earl that Harold fell in love. The object of his affection was Edith Swan Neck, or sometimes called Edith the Fair. I told you there would be more Ediths.
Swan Neck.
Swan Neck, I know. I love that name, isn't it? It sounds like something out of a fairy tale. Isn't it beautiful?
But hold on. Ethelred the Unready really meant that he didn't have good counsel. Does Swan Neck not mean what we think it means?
No.
So she really literally had a transplanted neck of a swan.
Okay. I don't think they were being literal.
That's I mean, maybe we need to resurrect the medieval English space program. And if they can do that,
they could do anything.
I mean, that's impressive.
It is. I'm going to just take a guess and say that she just had a really great neck.
What does that mean, a great neck?
Long, graceful. I'm thinking like Audrey Hepburn. Beautiful neck. I don't know. Now I feel creepy. Now I feel like a serial killer. I feel like Ed Gein talking about somebody's neck.
Yeah. Gonna make some notes here for some things to discuss after the
we're
podcast.
Gonna take a right turn and we're gonna go back in the story before I start talking more about necks and make it even. We don't know much about Edith Swan Neck or her background. What is certain is that she's not a lowly peasant. She had estates from around Essex and the surrounding areas.
I don't want to get ahead, obviously, because we're only in part one, but can I run one of the fragmentary things that I think I may have heard that I might know about her by you?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Is it true that he identifies him on the battlefields?
That is one of the stories, and we will get into that one.
Okay. I should be quiet.
You are jumping ahead, but yes, that is one of the tales told about
because
her.
She knows something about him that no one else knows.
Yes. Well, that makes it sound like it was some sort of deformity or something.
As I understand it, his entire back was like a turtle shell or something.
He's a Ninja Turtle.
Like, I, the Swan Neck, know that my husband was a turtle man hybrid. Okay.
No.
Sorry. For those of you listening at home, it's kind of late.
But yes, there is a legend about her.
Yes, she's a swan human hybrid, but no.
Yes.
Harold is probably not semi-reptilian.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You got it. They would be involved for the next 20 years, even though they don't have a church marriage. So think back to what Matt was talking about earlier. To quote the book, their union is much debated, but it was a common law, handfast partnership, which lasted until Harold's death. The sanctity of the relationship would remain formally unrecognized by the church, end quote. As we said, still early days of the church where they're working out what marriage really was. We already talked about Canute and his 2 wives, and Harold would eventually have one common law, one handfast one, or Edith Swan Neck, and another church-sanctioned one later on. But due to the length of the relationship, Harold and Edith Swan Neck must have really loved or cared for each other. This was not a marriage meant to provide Harold with more money or more power. The assumption then is that they really liked each other. Like us. It must have been love. The 2 would have 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls over the course of their relationship, starting in about the year 1046. It might have seemed like a good idea at first for Edward the Confessor to keep the Godwins close, yet in time he would start to chafe under their constant presence. There's a debate whether Godwin and later Harold were rulers in all but name, sidelining the meek-mannered Edward the Confessor. It's hard to say one way or the other, although it seems like most historians say that Edward was more involved than at least the Victorians and such gave him credit for. So it seems like this is one where traditional narratives have been changing. But that's not to say Godwin and Harold did not hold immense power. They knew England. They had been there their whole lives, unlike Edward, who still remained very much an outsider. Even with one of their own on the throne, problems began to emerge for Godwin, Harold, and the rest of the extended Godwin clan, because they're not the only power players at court. Tensions began to build between the Godwins, still led by our Earl Godwin, but now with his sons stepping into the game of politics, and a growing Norman faction. Recall, Edward, more Norman than English at this point, having spent decades abroad. When Edward became king, he brought over his Norman friends, forming this new power block that threatened the grip on the court that Godwin had held since the days of King Canute. So you've got the Normans on one hand, the Godwins on the other. There's gonna be tensions. Those simmering rivalries, the Godwin family versus the Normans, would soon boil over with disastrous consequences for Harold, his family, and the entire Godwin family. In 1051, a foreign visitor, Eustace of Boulogne, who was married to Edward's sister, and his men ended up in Dover on their way back across the Channel. We don't know if Eustace wanted to stir some things up with Godwin, as the book hypothesizes that his wife likely had told him about Godwin's involvement in Alfred's blinding and death. So, again, if he's married to Edward's sister, Alfred would have been her brother as well. And instead of this polite welcome to the brother-in-law to the king, Eustace and company, they got into this violent clash with the townspeople. At least 20 citizens died in the melee and around 10 of Eustace's men. Edward the Confessor blamed the town, not his brother-in-law. No great surprise there. This was Godwin territory, so Edward ordered Godwin to punish the townspeople for the spilling of blood. But Godwin refused. He put his foot down. He wanted to hear all the sides first to see what really happened, which sounds great. I'm Team Godwin on this one. This episode really does show that in terms of being an earl, he's pretty even-handed. To quote the book, Godwin would choose to risk Edward's ire rather than betray his vassals and the townspeople. So he's Team townspeople. If Edward, though, was looking for a pretext at this time to move against the all-powerful Godwins, he got it. With support from the other earls, Edward moved against Godwin. He summoned Godwin and Harold to a council meeting on September 24th, 1052. They were to come unarmed with only 12 men. To quote the book, what Godwin expected from the council meeting cannot be known, but in hindsight, it looks like he had already lost any chance of redemption even before attending. This was a different Edward, one now showing a determination to damage the Godwins irrevocably. End quote. Basically, at this point, Edward's clearly had enough of the Godwins. They've been meddling with everything. He's trying to show that he's his own man and that he's breaking free from the shackles. And if Godwin had any doubt to what was to come, the king would put those to rest very quickly. A bishop was playing mediator between the king and Godwin. He was sent to tell Godwin that he could have his peace and pardon if he could restore the king his brother Alfred. Whoa. Yeah, that doesn't bode well for Godwin, Harold, and the rest of them, because Alfred's dead, so there ain't no restoring of Alfred. R.I.P. Alfred. So again, this is where, if you're thinking, did Edward hold a grudge against Godwin and the family for killing his brother? I think we could say yes, if this is what he said.
Answer there. I think the jury is not out on that one.
No, he's mad. He's out for blood at this point. Edward was not in a forgiving mood, so any pent-up anger he had towards the family had begun to overflow. In a council meeting, Edward the Confessor declared the Godwins outlaws, so the entire family had 5 days to leave England. Edith, and Edward's queen and Harold's sister, she would not be fleeing into exile with them, but that does not mean Edward did not punish her for her family's perceived disloyalty. Before Godwin and his family had even left England, their shining star, their queen, was discarded by her husband Edward. To quote the book, Edward repudiated her and confiscated the whole of the queen's resources to the last penny. I'm going to say it. For a saintly figure, Edward the Confessor can sometimes be a dick, and this is one of those moments. He's tossing out his queen, and he's taking all of her money. Poor Edith, especially since she seems to have been trying to mold herself into a woman that Edward could love. She tried to make herself more Norman since she knew that's what Edward would be familiar with. She even had a Norman maid with her, presumably to translate at first between husband and wife. But her prime role had been to have children, heirs, and none had come. So this is where you could also say maybe Edward was as angry about that as he was about her being Godwin's daughter. He needed heirs. We've already talked about the succession crises that rocked England in the past couple of decades. He's thinking ahead and he's not getting any younger. He's solidly in middle age at this point. So now Edith was being tossed out of court along with the rest of her family. A divorce surely would follow, although there wasn't actually any real precedence for this happening before in Anglo-Saxon England. This is not Henry VIII's England at this point, but he needs heirs, so he needs a new wife. And he needs a wife who's preferably not a Godwin. The wheel of fortune had swung down, and violently the most powerful family in England was suddenly in exile. Godwin, Harold, and their families had no way of knowing if they'd ever even set foot in their homeland again. Edward back in England certainly did not believe the Godwins would ever step foot in the realm again. The Godwins are wealthy, but wealthy enough to raise a fleet to challenge the King of England. Unlikely. They're not Canute, who was a Danish king who had those resources. They're still just nobles. The family was scattered. Godwin and a few of his sons went to Bruges, while Harold and his 15-year-old brother Leofwine headed to Ireland. Ireland at this time had a strong Danish presence, and our Godwin family was part Danish, after all, so they would find support there. It's in Bruges against the odds that Godwin planned and plotted. The same with Harold over in Ireland. Even as an exile, the family had not lost all their support. Godwin could count on Wessex, the family's heartland, where people still had fond feelings towards them. But that's only if he could raise enough ships and men to get there. So he has to get the ships and the men over there, and then he's hoping there'll be a groundswell of support.
Well, there's not enough love for them to risk rebellion on their own. We still love you, but we're not going to risk our own necks.
Yeah, they kind of have to be there.
They're supportive, but pragmatic about it.
Yeah, and Edward at this time is also happily reassigning the earldom, so the people do seem to have preferred the Godwins to the new earls. Harold in Ireland and Godwin in Bruges both readied their fleets over the winter of 1051 into 1052. This is where you might wonder why it was Harold leading the way when he actually had an older brother, Sweyn. The older brother, he had managed to land himself in a lot of trouble. No great surprise there. His misdeeds included, but were far from limited to, trying to kidnap an abbess and marry her. Never a good thing to try to kidnap a nun. Just going to throw it out there. Once in exile, Sweyn, understanding what a fuck up he was, set off on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to repent for his many, many, many sins. That left second son Harold to step up and support his father in their goal of getting the Godwins back into their place of power. So that's why Harold, he's not technically the first son, but he is in all but name. In July of 1052, Harold would leave Ireland with only 9 ships, but it was a coordinated attack, doubtless planned with their father, so the Godwins acted together as one, at least for the time being. Harold and his fleet landed in North Somerset, only to find a militia ready to drive them off. We don't know why they faced opposition here, but this is where the book speculates that the oldest Godwin son, our useless Sweyn, had ruled that area previously. And like much of what Sweyn did, he did it poorly. So they're landing in the one place that really doesn't like the Godwins. You could say the mission to take back their lands and the power was off to a little bit of a rocky start. Harold, though, he won the battle, if you can even call it that. Not even really a battle. He did end up killing over 30 of the men in the local opposing militia. Back into their boats, Harold and his army went. They were supposed to link up with his father, Godwin, and his younger brother, Tostig, at the Isle of Wight. But Harold was late, and instead his father went raiding the coast. He hit the city of Portland, which, according to the book, was likely picked because it was, quote, prime royal estate owned by the king. They're kind of hitting back at the king now. It's the king's land. It has an estate. So they want to show him that they're back, that they're meaning business. And it would be in Portland that Harold linked up with his father late in August. If Edward had not paid much attention to the raids and the movements of the Godwin family before, they had his attention now. He's finally starting to come around to the fact that the Godwins are trying to get back into England. Supporters, like the Godwins suspected, flocked to their banner, their numbers growing daily. And now the Godwins and their fleet headed towards London, towards Edward. Edward the Confessor, you're in danger.
It's getting real.
It is. On their way, they burnt another royal estate, Milton Regis, to the ground. You'd think that that would be enough to stir even a relatively laissez-faire Edward the Confessor out of his stupor, but alas, no. My man, you have a fleet sailing straight at you, pillaging along the way. I appreciate that you're not prone to overreaction, but maybe this is where you react just a little bit, just a tiny bit. I guess he really was Ethelred the unready son. Emphasis on the unready part. No DNA test needed there. Edward did basically nothing. His fleet pulled back to protect London, and that was about it. He would eventually realize that he needed more men than the London militia could provide, but by then it was already too late. It was much too late. They couldn't get there in time to be of any use. So it was becoming increasingly clear that Godwin, Harold, and the rest of the Godwin sons had the upper hand, and this time around, no other magnates were prepared to fight them. Some of the nobility likely even sympathized with their plight. After all, if Edward could exile the most powerful family in the realm, what was to stop him from doing that again to them? Forcing nobles with often competing agendas to band together, never a good idea. Could just ask King John in another 200 years. The Godwin fleet was able to sail through London Bridge after some careful negotiation with the citizens on September 14th, 1052. That was just under a year since the Godwins had been sent into exile. Now, London was theirs for the taking. A standoff ensued with the royal fleet. No one really wanted another civil war. The past decades had seen Danish invasion and king after king taking the English throne. Think of all the stuff we already talked about that had happened. Were they all prepared to put their lives and livelihoods on the line again? Both sides knew that an outright battle would serve no one. Edward the Confessor was no warrior. He's more of a monk than a warrior. And he had badly underestimated the support the Godwins would rally once they landed in England. To go to battle and lose could mean Edward the Confessor could lose the crown that he finally had after decades of waiting. For Godwin, the risks were just as high, maybe too high. If he openly moved against the king, there'd be no path back to power for him or his family. There'd be no coming back from this if he lost, no second chances.
They either win and triumph or they're totally disgraced, right?
If you actually raise arms against the king, remember before, they're in conflict with him, but Godwin never actually raised arms against the king. It might be that Godwin and Harold and the other sons never intended to go to war with the king. It does kind of read like a game of chicken, of calling the others bluff. Either way, no battle came. The real fight would happen the next day, not on the water, but across the negotiation table. With some difficulty, the sides finally agreed. The Godwins would be restored to their previous lands and favor. Yay, Godwins! Harold and Godwin had their earldoms back. With that, and with promises that they would be unharmed, Harold and his father Godwin came ashore. Godwin spoke about the charges put against him before the exile, speaking so well that William of Malmesbury later noted that, quote, that aged man, master of language that would move the hearts of his audience, cleared himself successfully of all the charges brought against him, end quote. Even better for Godwin and Harold, Edward sent away some of his Norman advisors. He's going to have still plenty of Norman men around him, but like many people in power, it was a way of blaming the men around the king for bad decisions versus the king himself. Things had kind of gone to shit after the Godwins left because they were really good at what they did. They were running a kingdom. And so now Edward, he has a few fall guys, sends some Norman friends back. The point was the Godwins were back, baby. It was as if nothing had happened. Edith, too, she was shuffled out of the abbey and restored to her position as queen.
Wow.
Yeah, so even Edith comes back. Edward the Confessor and Edith would remain childless, but Edward must have been resigned to the fact that he's now stuck in the marriage. He'd be at the mercy of the Godwins for the rest of his reign. A major change in the Godwin family happened only a week after the restoration of all their lands post-exile. Sweyn, the oldest son, our little fuck-up, he had gone on that pilgrimage while his family fought for their rights. He died. He had been on his way home from Constantinople when he either sickened and died or he was killed in a skirmish along the road. There's competing stories about that. His family wouldn't hear the news for months. But with Sweyn gone, Harold was now heir to everything that Godwin owned. In truth, we already talked about that he had already been a much more natural heir than Sweyn ever was, although some indicate that Godwin, the patriarch, always favored his more wayward son. How Harold felt about his older brother, we don't know. For an ambitious young man, Harold might have been relieved to know the vast fortune and lands of his fathers would be in his steady hands versus those of his impulsive, erratic brother. Succession might have already been on his mind. In his mid-50s, Godwin's health had begun to fail him. That last year had brought so much turmoil. Fighting, clawing his way back to power, had left an indelible mark. The news of Sweyn's death shook the old man deeply. Just weeks after receiving the news of his son's death in April of 1053, Godwin, along with his sons, Harold and Tostig, were at a dinner with the king in Winchester when Godwin, quote, suddenly sank down against the footstool, deprived of speech and of all his strength. Godwin was carried to the king's chambers, where he died 3 days later, most likely from a stroke. Although we've got another untimely death, another quick death. There's some very convenient deaths in the story. After the Norman conquest, propaganda eager to paint Godwin and his son Harold in the worst possible light claimed that he was struck down by God for his supposed role in the death of Edward's brother Alfred all those years earlier. One story has Godwin swearing to Edward, "May God not let me swallow this bite if I ever knowingly harmed Alfred or you, only to choke to death on the spot." Great story.
Okay, that seems timely.
Great story, just not a very likely one. These stories about that night came about much later, at the point when William the Conqueror from Normandy was on the English throne. So we really shouldn't believe them. Far from these caricatures of the greedy Godwins, Godwin had died as a man without equal. Thanks to him, the Godwin family had become the ultimate survivors and consummate courtiers. Godwin himself had survived numerous kings and an exile that could have been the end for him and his dynasty. With his tenacity and grit, Godwin had left Harold not just his earldom, but a political machine to keep running. To quote the later chronicled The Life of Edward, quote, Earl Godwin's son Harold, eldest in birth as in wisdom, was by the king's favor appointed to the earldom in his place. And at this, the whole English host breathed again and was consoled for its loss. So you lost Godwin, but everybody's happy because you have Harold. He's steady, and people know that he's going to follow in his father's footsteps. Losing a father and a great man such as Godwin could not have been easy. But at long last, Harold was free from his father's shadow. Up until now, we've mostly seen him lingering in the background while Godwin steered the family to fortune and to ruin. Such is the fate of being the son of a formidable man. Now is Harold's turn to lead. He's no longer sidelined, even in an episode about himself. So I think this is where we will leave off for our story today, so that next episode we could talk about Harold coming into his own, the rest of Edward the Confessor's reign, and the succession dispute that ends at the Battle of Hastings.
So now we have all of the necessary backstory to do armchair psychology about why he makes the decisions he does.
I think so. Hopefully you guys agree. I know it's a lot of Earl Godwin, Harold's dad, but I feel like to know the family is to know Harold. As he's gotten older, Harold's right alongside his dad, and he's learning from his father, so I felt like it was worthwhile. So hopefully you guys feel that way too.
Well, and it helps to get a handle on the relationship between Danish identity and, English identity is still really fragmented at this point. And then throw in we can see right now all of the sort of foundational arguments that will be made later that still confuse my students when they look at something from the 18th or even 19th century, and the King of England will be claiming to also be, I'm also in charge of France. I really am. It's England, it's Wales, it's Scotland, it's a big part of Ireland most of the time. And while we're at it, France, and you can kind of see how that this was a period where those claims were more ambiguous.
We will talk a little bit about Scotland and Wales because Harold's involved in some of those disputes in the next episode. But yeah, you've got England going from little kingdoms. We've got our Mercia, our Northumbria, and our Wessex to Wessex really coming into the fore and becoming the House of Wessex. That's Ethelred's house. That's Edward's house. Then you still have those pauses of the Wessex line as the Danes come in, and then you get Dane/Wessex kings with Emma and Canute's son. I think to understand the rest of Edward the Confessor's reign, I think getting some background on him too is key. He's on my list to do, as well as Canute and Emma were on my list too. So who knows, maybe at some point we'll go back and we'll go into flesh out some of their story, since we didn't cover it in great detail, just what you need to know. Hopefully it wasn't too much Anglo-Saxon history, but not everybody's familiar with what's going on here. And again, it's all setting the stage for this showdown at the end of Edward the Confessor's reign to Harold becoming king. I think you need to be grounded in that if we're going to really talk about Harold's claim to the kingship, because I think that's going to be a big point of contention, I think, when we get to the judgment piece.
You've built up some suspense here. I'm curious to see how the judgment goes, though, because how are we going to judge somebody who's cut short? He doesn't really get to live long enough to establish a legacy, does he? He's known for what he lost, not for what he gained.
I think a large part of the judgment will come down to that piece of, is he a usurper? Did he take the throne? Not just from William. Most people think post Edward the Confessor that it's between Harold and William the Conqueror. But there's at least two other men in the mix. We have Harold Hardrada, another Viking, and then we also have Edgar the Atheling. We'll get into his lineage next time. I think it will come down to, did Harold steal the throne? Did he break oaths? I think it'll all come down to that in terms of judging him.
I'm ready.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening. Again, if you like this podcast, rate, review, do all the things. And if you have an idea of who you want us to cover next, we're always looking for suggestions. You can email us. We have the email in our podcast description, or you can send us a note on Instagram. That's all linked below. Until we speak next time. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.